All right, welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about React state patterns. So there's really only three things we're going to discuss. They all have to do with React state, sort of getting better, being a better React developer when we're working with state. And that's pretty much all the time. So first, we're going to talk about how we update state based off of existing values in the state. So far, we've been basically overwriting values, changing a number from like 10 to 7 or to 7 to 50, random numbers. We've been changing a Boolean, making it true or setting something to false, but we haven't been working with existing values and altering them or updating them, like taking 10 and adding 1 to it. Like if we had a scorekeeper and we wanted to add 1 to the current value of that scorekeeper. I'll show you what I mean in this video. That's what we're going to talk about. Then after this video, we'll talk about how we manage state updates for mutable data structures. We've been storing strings and numbers and booleans in our state, but we haven't yet worked with arrays or objects, or even worse, nested arrays and objects full of arrays. So there's some special things we have to consider when we're doing that. So that's what we'll talk about after this video. And then finally, the rest of this section will be devoted to best practices when we're creating applications and modeling state and designing our components. What are some of the things we should keep in mind, sort of rules of thumb when you're working with state? All right, so let's begin with that first point, setting state using existing values in your state. So to demonstrate what I'm referring to, here is a very simple app. Nothing's really set up yet. So I have a score value in the state. Imagine this is a game. And when we click this button, single kill, I want it to add 1 to the score value. So right now, I'm just displaying the state.score, and I have a button that doesn't do anything. So let's add an on click and set it to this dot, let's just call it single kill. And then I'm going to define single kill. And before I forget, I'm going to bind it up top. This dot single kill equals this dot single kill dot bind this. Okay, so inside of single kill, we want to take the current value of score and add 1. So the simplest way to do that is this dot set state. We need to use set state, which we've already discussed why. And we're going to update score. But I can't just set it to a number because I don't know what that value should be. It depends on what the current value is. So one option is this right here, this dot state dot score plus 1. And this will work in this situation, but I'm going to talk about why this is not a good idea and show you some problems with it in just a moment. But let's just verify that it does work. So we're adding 1 to score. Each time I click, we are indeed updating the state.score by 1. We're adding 1 to it. So that's what we wanted to happen. But I'm warning you now, this is not what you want to do. You don't want to be updating your state like this when it depends on the previous state. So to illustrate why, let's say that there is another button here, and this button is called triple kill, and we want it to add 3. So this is going to be pretty silly and contrived, but it's going to illustrate the problem. So I'm going to call a function called this.triplekill, which doesn't exist yet. And of course, I'm going to bind it up top before I forget. So we'll do triple kill and then define it down here. Now, the smart way of doing it would just be to add 3. But let's say that I'm not smart and I'm doing it this way. I'm going to do 3 different set state calls. Each time I'm adding 1 to the previous state. So if it's at 0 at the beginning and I click the triple kill button, we're going to set score to be the current value, which is 0 plus 1. So that should then be 1. Then down here, we're going to do the same thing. So the score should be 1, and then we're adding 1, it should be 2. And again, 2 plus 1 should be 3. However, if we see what actually happens over here, assuming I didn't type something incorrectly, it's only adding 1. It's working the same way as this one. Why is that happening? Well, it has to do with how set state works. We've established that set state is asynchronous, and that means that it's not safe to assume that your previous call has finished when you call your next set state. And also, remember that React will sometimes batch together different calls to set state into one call for performance reasons. And that's what's happening here. It's seeing these 3 calls each time we're passing in an object, and we're basically doing the exact same thing each time. Essentially, what it will do is take the last thing that we pass in and enact that. So if I said plus equals 4 here, and we come back, you'll see that it's now adding 4. So the reason for this has to do with how it actually merges things, how it takes these objects and combines them. And it makes sense if you think about it this way. If we updated score to be 100, and then immediately after I updated it to be 150, this is the latest version, if that makes sense. So it's going to prioritize, in the case where there's two calls that it's batching together and they're setting the same thing, it's going to assume you want this one because it came second. But that's not the case, especially when we're working like this, where we're working with existing values. We want all of them to run. So this isn't going to work for us. Instead, we can use an alternate callback form. So if your set state call depends on the current state, a value that's already in there, it's best to use the alternate callback form. And we saw we don't have to do that in certain situations. This certainly worked okay. But then this silly demonstration hopefully makes the point of why you should care about it and why it's best, if you are updating existing values in the state, to use the callback form. So this magic callback form, what's it look like? This.setState, and we pass in a callback function instead of passing in an object. And inside of that callback function, we make the current state a parameter, and it should return an object that represents the new state. So here's an example. We can set state, we'll pass in a function, and we need to add this parameter current state, or you can just call it state. Often you'll see st for state, but this represents the current state values. Then we can update count the same way, except instead of referencing this.state.count, we reference that parameter current state.count plus 1. So let me show you that over here. I've commented out the original just so you have it as a reference, as the not ideal way of doing this. And I'm going to redefine triple kill down here. And instead of this .setState where we pass in our object, what we're going to do is pass in a callback. So there's a single parameter. Often you'll actually do state and props, but for now we're just going to pass in state as the parameter. So st is fine. And inside of here, we're going to return our state object, basically what we want to do, the change that we want. So we're going to say score should now equal the old state. So that's what st is referring to, the current state, actually, not the old state. The current state dot score plus 1. Just like that. And I'll save and duplicate this 3 times or 2 times. And now each time we do this, they no longer will be batched together. There won't be any issues or conflicts. So we'll update it, take the current score, add 1 to it, and then update it again. Take that current score, which now has been updated already, and add 1 and do it a 3rd time. So let's just verify it does work. If I click triple kill, we are now adding 3. Before, we were only adding 1 because they were being batched together and only one of them was actually running. Okay, so that brings me to my last little point here, which has to do with just a nice way of refactoring this code, abstracting our state updates to separate functions. So since we can pass in this function to this.setState, it lends itself nicely to creating our own functions to set state. So something like this, where you define a function, like increment counter, and it returns an object that represents the state, and then we can just call this.setState and pass in that function. Now, why would you care about this? Well, it's nicer to read. If you get into testing, it's a lot easier to test and cleaner, but also it comes up a lot when we're working with things like Redux. So let me just refactor this to show you it. So I'm going to also comment this one out and keep it. And this time I'm going to define a function called increment score, something like that. And all that we do is return. So it's going to take a parameter called state. Let's do old state just to make this clear, or current state. And we're going to return an object where score is equal to current state dot score plus 1, just like that. And now if I define triple kill one more time, we can do this dot set state of increment score and just pass that right on in, increment score, and then do that 3 times. So this is just a way of cleaning up code. You do not have to do this, and we won't be doing this for every single time we update the state moving forward, but I wanted to introduce this to you because you will see this, basically just extracting this to be its own function that you can reuse. Now this is still a pretty dumb one, to be honest, because we're updating it by 1 each time, and why would we be calling it 3 times? Why not just have a function to update it by 3 or update it by 3 right here? Oh, And we do need to make sure we're referencing this .increment score. Okay, now if we try it, it still works. We have our single kill, which is implemented the way that I said you should avoid. I added a comment to make that clear. This technically works okay, but this is not a pattern we want to follow when we're setting state based off of existing state values. Okay, so hopefully this was clear. I know this example was silly, but it's kind of hard to illustrate this with what we know so far. But just trust me, if you're updating the state based off of existing values, you want to use this .set state and pass in a callback. And this was one refactored way of doing that, and here's the original way we saw. All right, moving on, we're going to talk about mutating state when we're working with arrays and objects and nested stuff, and it gets messy.